Hello and welcome back to another Monster Monday, a series where I draw a creature from D&D and I talk about its lore and its history and what it's like to fight in-game. Monsters are usually one of your suggestions from down in the comments, and today is no different. Today's suggestion comes in from Contemplate Tech, and they have suggested the Rust Monster. Rust monsters are great creatures in D&D and are usually loved more by DMs than they are by players. Sometimes they make players and the creatures in your D&D world, or at least its more humanoid inhabitants, a little bit nervous. The monster manual even tells us that most dwarves would rather face a squad of orcs than confront a single rust monster. But why is that? They're a challenge rating 1/2 creature whose only attack is a pretty underwhelming bite, which only deals 1d8 plus 1 piercing damage. They've only got 14 armor class, and they're unaligned, so they're not even evil creatures. In fact, I'd go as far to say that if you ever get bitten by a rust monster, it's probably only because you happen to be wearing or carrying its favourite food. But what is a rust monster in D&D? Well, essentially they're the kind of giant magical termites of D&D, and it's sentences like that which make me really love this game. They're medium-sized, insect-like monstrosities who are covered in thick chitinous plates. Unlike almost all insects, they have 4 legs rather than 6. The back set of which are usually drawn like enormous spined cricket legs, which probably grant this creature its impressive 40-foot movement speed. It usually has 2 enormous feathered antennae on their heads, and its tail has changed a lot over the years. Started off looking a little bit like a tiny bow tie, and now, in more recent editions, it kind of looks more like a feathery trident. This monster was one of the early creatures that Gary Gygax put in the game after being inspired by an assortment of strange and confusing dime store toys that were made in Hong Kong in the 70s, along with things like the owlbear and other very early additions to the game. Gary said, "When I picked up a bag of plastic monsters, there was a figure that looked rather like a lobster with a propeller on its tail. Nothing very fearsome came to mind. Then inspiration struck me. It was a rust monster," which sounds like a totally natural conclusion to draw, but then Gary Gygax was a very unusual man. Now, rather than a lobster, I'm going to be drawing some inspiration from a few different places with this drawing. I've been looking at crickets and locusts for those legs, especially with these creatures' appetites. I think locusts are fairly fitting. And as I mentioned before, these are the termites of the D&D world, although they don't eat wood. So I think termites will definitely come into this. So we can basically say that these things are kind of like 5-foot long locusts or termites or something like that, with a little bit of extra flavour. They're largely famous because of their unending appetite for oxidized, rusted in other words, ferrous metals. They absolutely cannot get enough of the stuff. Now, termites have a similarly insatiable appetite for wood and other organic or decaying materials, but they're so tiny that although constantly hungry, it would take over 3,000 years for a single termite to eat all the wood in a 1,000 square foot space. But they live in massive colonies of hundreds of thousands that all coordinate together just like ants. So they can make quicker work of this. But rust monsters are supposed to be solitary wanderers, however. They don't live in colonies, they don't coordinate together, they are individuals. The downside of this is that it seems like they can take on much more food per rust monster compared to their termite cousins. They can eat 1 foot cubed of metal in a single bite, which is a pretty horrifying rate of consumption. Wave their long antennae around in the air and use them to detect the scent of ferrous metals within 30 feet of them. Just like termites, who can't really see and don't technically have a sense of smell as we do, but they too use their antennae to pick up really intricate and delicate odor particles in the air. Then the rust monster will pounce and strike a nearby source of metal, including raw ore, old machinery, perhaps jewelry, or even the armor on your back. They're not even adverse to chewing on the pointy ends of swords, so they're not fussy eaters. The upside of this kind of single-minded focus just for food seems to involve the idea that they ignore creatures without any armor in a fight. So wizards and monks probably will be fine. They've even been known to give up on chasing down adventurers who have angered them, maybe even blown chunks out of them, in favour for eating the weapons and shields of those fleeing combat, perhaps those left behind at their camps. So if you're ever finding a rust monster too much, make sure to run away and leave your weapons behind. They'll usually stop to eat those instead. But rust monsters can be a player's worst fear at low levels. They're a great tool for DMs to use if their party have that one really annoying player intent on becoming absolutely indestructible by making the most of a very high constitution score, wearing tons of heavy armor and a shield, and getting all of those pesky armor class buffs from the nearby cleric or wizard. Because a rust monster doesn't care who you are or what you're trying to achieve. If you're wearing armor, it'll eat it. They have two fantastic abilities for really throwing players for a loop if they've been relying too much on shields and armor. The first is a passive skill called Rust Metal, unsurprisingly. It assumes that the whole beast generates some kind of corrosive field and results in any non-magical weapon that hits a rust monster, if it's made of a metal that can rust that is, takes a -1 penalty to all damage rolls, and that's permanently. It just starts to corrode as soon as it touches the creature, and after this weapon has taken 5 of these in total, it's completely destroyed. Additionally, if someone's shooting at this thing with bullets, or an archer is using metal-tipped arrows, those instantly corrode away upon impact after dealing damage. And the antennae aren't just for sniffing out the rust monster's next meal, it can also brush them on a non-magical object made of ferrous metal, i.e. a metal that rusts, like your fabulous dwarven helmet you saved up for, and I would imagine this feels like being tickled by a feather duster attached to a Great Dane-sized cockroach. As it turns out, and this was news to me, termites are tiny cockroaches. Despite their heads and bodies looking a little bit more like ants and their behaviour sort of indicating they're ant-like, they are in fact of the cockroach family. So picture that next time you find little holes in your kitchen table. After being tickled gently by the mother of all roaches, any armour will start to oxidise and dissolve, dealing a permanent -1 AC to this particular piece of gear, and if your AC drops to 10, or if your shield drops to a +0 from this kind of move that the rust monster can do, it will slowly embrace Robert Downey Jr. with a panicked look on its face, saying "I don't want to go" before crumbling into dust. I'm sorry, that was maybe too soon. Now this rusting on contact thing made me think, made me wonder how these powers might work. And I know, it's a monstrosity, it's from D&D, so likely it's magic. However, it made me think what process is going on here, because let's say that magically this enhances or produces something that causes rust. We know how rusting works in the world, so there might be a way that we can use this. As well, after all, once you've killed a rust monster, if you can store them safely without them corroding the rest of your gear in your backpack, you're bound to want to take their antennae with you, so you can forge some kind of rusting blades. Magic weapons that would rust somebody else's armor, right? So it's important to think about how to touch and handle a rust monster's chitinous plates and antennae properly. But there are two main options for how it might be achieving this rust effect. Either they are producers of some kind of heavy oxygen-filled compound. Rust's scientific name is oxidization, and it's the process by which oxygen binds with an existing metal, which makes it structurally weaker, and start to corrode it. So they could be producing something that is massively oxygen rich and magically speeds up the oxidizing process. If that's the case, that means that they might be able to produce breathable oxygen, and that might explain why, as they're burrowers of the earth, they live very deep in the ground, they might be able to breathe down there as well. This might make them really good pets for miners or even divers. Perhaps they produce oxygen bubbles if they're submerged in water, a little pocket of safety in the sea. Speaking of the sea though, if you've ever looked at bridges that are built over oceans, or old boats and things like that, in fact if you even live by the seaside, you might have noticed that most of the stuff closer to the sea that is made out of metal rusts very quickly, and that's because salt and salt water acts like a catalyst, speeding up the reaction of oxidization. So it could just be that the rust monster constantly produces a really high concentration of saline salt water all over its body, or something very similar. A little bit of flavor, therefore, pardon the pun, is if your players do manage to kill a rust monster and take a rest afterwards, they choose to maybe eat some of this creature, you could say that it tastes incredibly salty, like 1,000 anchovies, because this thing is basically constructed out of seawater in such a concentrated fashion that it would rust metal instantly. Who knows what it would do to their insides? That's up to you as a DM. Maybe it's just unpleasant, maybe it's acidic, who knows? But they're the bane of the traditional fighter, tank, cleric, healer dynamic, and I'm pretty sure in previous editions these rusting powers also affected things like magic items, but it seems like you're safe in 5th edition. I suppose you could add something like that back into the game, maybe increase the challenge rating of the rust monster, or perhaps turn it into a plot point, maybe some kind of super rust monster was magically engineered by an evil wizard, and it can eat magic items if you have one that you've given to your party and you super regret it. But these creatures are a great reason to always have a monk, a spellcaster, or a druid on the team. Druids may hate normal termites with all their affinity for wood, but they can't use metal weapons or armor, so fighting a rust monster for them is more like fighting a really, really ugly puppy. Mischievous, but nothing to worry about ultimately. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. As always, I had great fun drawing it. Although they're pretty weak and they've got a low challenge rating, they're a great creature to throw in at pretty much any level, because players will always rely on metal, and provided that they've not completely surrounded themselves in magic armor and magic items, they still pose a genuine threat to a player's gear and how much treasure they're taking back, as long as some of it can be eroded. They're iconic creatures, and I'm really glad that I got a chance to draw one. So thank you, Contemplate Tech, for your suggestion. If you have a suggestion of a monster you'd like to see me draw, please make sure to leave it down in the comments below. Although I haven't been quite so vocal in the comments recently, I have been reading everything you've been writing, and all of your suggestions have been getting added to the to-draw list, so it doesn't matter when you suggest it. Eventually I will get round to drawing your creature. I'm just trying to make my way through the list in the order that I was suggested things. If you enjoyed today's video, please make sure to leave it a little thumbs up, a little like down below. Maybe favourite it and share it with someone who you think would like to learn about rust monsters. Maybe the rest of your party need warned before your DM throws one of these things at you. And if you like the content that I put out, I make 2 videos a week, so make sure to subscribe and hit the little bell icon for updates about my videos, so you can keep up to date with everything that I'm making. We're still growing as a channel, so everything you can do like that massively helps us out. Thank you so much for your help. If you love today's drawing and you'd like a copy of it for yourself, please make sure to head over to my Patreon page, where backers get all sorts of different rewards, but one of which is a copy of every Monster Monday that I draw each month, as either a digital or a physical print. But anyway guys, thank you so much for joining me, happy monster hunting, and have a lovely day.